Can you imagine risking your own life to answer a cry for help coming from a wild bear? Picture this. It's 3 in the morning on one of the coldest nights Alaska has seen in decades. The kind of cold that burns your lungs with every breath, where the wind doesn't just howl. It screams through the wilderness like a living thing trying to tear apart everything in its path. Doctor Samuel Keller steps outside his remote cabin, boots crunching through snow so deep it reaches his knees. The beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife through black velvet. He's lived out here for 2 years now, trading the chaos of emergency rooms for the brutal peace of the Alaskan wilderness, but tonight something is different. Tonight, something is wrong. The Williwaw winds are fierce, carrying with them the ancient songs of this untamed land, when suddenly Samuel freezes mid-step. There it is again. That sound. Not the wind, not the creaking of ice-heavy branches, but something else entirely. Something desperate. Something that makes his doctor's instincts fire like lightning through his veins. It's a cry that cuts through the storm with such raw desperation that it stops his heart for a full second. Samuel has heard thousands of cries for help in his 28 years as an emergency physician. He's rushed toward gunshot victims, pulled bodies from car wrecks, held dying children in his arms while their parents screamed. But this sound is different. This sound is wild, primal, and it's coming from something that could kill him with a single swipe of its claws. His breath forms clouds in the -40 air as he stands there, every survival instinct screaming at him to go back inside, lock the door, and pretend he never heard anything. But Samuel Keller didn't spend 3 decades saving lives to start ignoring cries for help now. The sound comes again, weaker this time, barely audible above the roaring wind, and that's when he sees it. A shadow moving through the snow, stumbling, falling, struggling to keep going. His medical training kicks in immediately. Something is hurt. Something is dying. And despite every rational thought telling him to run, despite knowing that what he's about to do could cost him everything, Samuel takes a step forward into the storm. Because sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to a single moment of courage. Sometimes saving a life means risking your own. And sometimes the most unlikely connections happen in the most dangerous places. What Samuel doesn't know yet is that the next few hours will change both their lives forever. Nome. Alaska sits on the edge of the world like a forgotten outpost clinging to the shores of the Bering Sea, where civilization meets the raw, unforgiving wilderness that has claimed more lives than most people could imagine. This is a land where temperatures plummet to depths that would kill an unprepared soul in minutes, where the aurora borealis dances across skies so vast they make you feel like a speck of dust in the universe. Samuel's cabin sits 43 miles northeast of Nome, accessible only by snowmobile or bush plane when weather permits, which in January it rarely does. The nearest neighbor is 18 miles away through terrain so treacherous that even the most experienced mushers think twice before making the journey. The landscape here doesn't just challenge you, it tests every fiber of your being. Endless stretches of white tundra roll like frozen ocean waves toward jagged mountain peaks that pierce the sky like ancient spears. The trees, mostly stunted spruce and birch, bow under the weight of snow and ice, their branches creating intricate lacework against the perpetual twilight of winter. When the wind picks up, as it does most nights, it transforms this already harsh environment into something that feels almost alien, where visibility drops to 0 and the temperature can fall another 20 degrees in minutes. The Inupiat people have called this land home for thousands of years, and their elders speak of the deep spiritual connection between all living things in this harsh paradise. They understand something that outsiders like Samuel are only beginning to grasp, that survival here isn't just about having the right gear or enough food, it's about respecting the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's absolute authority. The local elders tell stories around fires that burn through the long winter nights, stories of bears who remember kindness, of wolves who guide lost travelers to safety, of a land that rewards those who approach it with humility and punishes those who don't. Samuel came here 2 years ago carrying the weight of 28 years in emergency medicine, burned out from watching too many people die despite his best efforts, exhausted from the constant pressure of life and death decisions that came every single shift. He'd saved thousands of lives, But the ones he couldn't save haunted his dreams and followed him through his waking hours like ghosts, demanding answers he didn't have. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind when he announced he was buying a remote cabin in Alaska, trading his six-figure salary and comfortable suburban life for kerosene lamps and wood-burning stoves, for days when the only human voice he heard was his own. The isolation out here is absolute in ways that city dwellers can't comprehend. There are weeks when the only sounds are wind, the settling of his cabin's wooden bones, and the distant howl of wolves calling to each other across the frozen wilderness. Samuel has learned to find peace in the silence, to appreciate the way moonlight transforms the snow-covered landscape into something that looks like another planet entirely. He's discovered muscles he never knew he had from splitting wood and hauling water, developed an intimate relationship with weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death, learned to read the subtle signs that nature broadcasts to those wise enough to pay attention. But the loneliness is real, sometimes crushing in its intensity. There are nights when Samuel sits by his wood stove, listening to the wind tear at his cabin like an angry beast, when he questions every decision that brought him to this frozen edge of existence. He misses human conversation, misses the adrenaline rush of emergency medicine, misses the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. Yet somehow this brutal landscape has begun to heal wounds in his soul that he didn't even know were there, forcing him to confront parts of himself that were buried under decades of professional responsibility and urban noise. The respect for wildlife here isn't just cultural, it's survival. Bears, wolves, moose, and countless other creatures have adapted to thrive in conditions that would kill most humans in hours. Samuel has learned to move through their world as a guest, not a conqueror, understanding that every step outside his door takes him into territory where he is no longer at the top of the food chain. If you love real-life stories of survival and heartwarming connections, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for this incredible journey. The storm had been building for 3 days, transforming Samuel's world into a whirling vortex of white that made it impossible to see beyond his own outstretched hand. He'd been through Alaska storms before, but this one felt different, angrier, more personal somehow, as if the wilderness itself was testing his resolve to stay in this unforgiving place. The wind rattled his cabin's windows with such violence that he'd reinforced them with plywood earlier that day, and the temperature had dropped so low that his breath formed ice crystals that tinkled to the floor like tiny wind chimes every time he exhaled. Samuel was heating water for coffee on his wood stove when movement outside caught his peripheral vision. At first he dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks in the swirling snow, but then he saw it again, something dark against the white, moving in a way that didn't match the chaotic dance of the storm. He wiped the condensation from his window with his sleeve, pressing his face against the cold glass, and that's when his heart nearly stopped. Through the fogged-up window, struggling through snow that reached almost to the top of its legs, was a bear cub. But this wasn't the playful, curious creature you might see in nature documentaries. This cub was in serious trouble. Samuel could see immediately that something was terribly wrong with its left hind leg. The way it dragged behind as the cub struggled forward, the unnatural angle, the obvious pain in every labored step. The little bear was shivering so violently that Samuel could see the tremors even through the storm, its dark fur matted with ice and snow, its small body fighting a losing battle against the brutal cold that was stealing its life with every passing second. Samuel watched in horror as the cub stumbled, fell face first into a snowdrift, struggled to get back up, fell again. Each attempt to stand became weaker than the last, and Samuel realized with the cold clarity of medical training that he was watching something die right outside his door. The cub was hypothermic, injured, and rapidly running out of the energy needed to survive. In his years as an emergency physician, Samuel had seen this same desperate struggle countless times, the moment when a body begins shutting down, when life starts slipping away despite every effort to hold on. The cub took another few faltering steps and collapsed just meters from Samuel's front door, its small sides heaving with exhaustion, steam rising from its body like a soul departing. Samuel could see its eyes through the storm, dark, frightened, but still fighting, still hoping for something, anything, that might save it from the cold that was claiming its young life. Those eyes held the same desperate plea for help that Samuel had seen in trauma rooms and emergency wards, the universal language of a creature that doesn't want to die. Every instinct Samuel had developed over 3 decades of medical practice screamed at him to act, to do something, to use his skills to save a life that was slipping away. His hands actually moved toward the door handle before his rational mind caught up with his emotions. This wasn't a human patient brought to him in a sterile hospital environment with backup and equipment and protocol. This was a wild animal, a predator, even if it was just a cub. And somewhere out there in the storm, probably watching, probably close enough to charge his cabin in seconds, was its mother. Samuel had heard the stories from local hunters and guides about mother bears with cubs. There was no more dangerous animal in Alaska than a female bear protecting her young. They would charge through gunfire, fight to the death, tear apart anything they perceived as a threat to their babies. If Samuel opened that door, if he so much as stepped outside, he could be signing his own death warrant. The mother might be watching from the tree line, waiting to see what this strange human would do, ready to attack the moment he showed any interest in her cub. But the alternative was standing here, safe and warm inside his cabin, watching a young animal die slowly in the cold just steps from his door. Samuel thought about all the times in the emergency room when he'd had to make split-second decisions between safety and saving a life, when protocol said one thing but his conscience demanded another. The cub's breathing was becoming more labored, its movements weaker. In another few minutes, it would be too late for any intervention to matter. Samuel's medical training and his human compassion warred with his survival instincts and common sense, creating a conflict that tore at his soul like nothing he'd experienced since leaving medicine behind. Samuel stood frozen at his window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the cub's chest rise and fall in increasingly shallow movements. His mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each one ending in either his death or the cub's, and he felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions that had driven him from medicine in the first place. How many times had he stood in hospital corridors, faced with choices that would haunt him regardless of what he decided? How many times had he been forced to choose between calculated risks and certain loss? Should he risk opening the door to a potentially dangerous animal? The question hammered against his skull like a migraine. Every wildlife safety course he'd taken since moving to Alaska had drilled the same message into his head. Never approach bears, especially cubs, because the mother is always nearby and always ready to kill anything she perceives as a threat. Samuel had seen the aftermath of bear attacks during his time in Anchorage General's emergency room. Humans torn apart like rag dolls, faces and limbs mangled beyond recognition. Trauma so severe that even experienced surgeons had trouble maintaining their composure. But what if the mother was already dead? What if she'd been killed by hunters or had fallen through ice or had succumbed to the same brutal storm that was now claiming her cub? Samuel's medical mind began calculating probabilities and possibilities. A healthy mother bear wouldn't let her cub wander this far from shelter in a storm like this. She would have found a den, a cave, somewhere to ride out the weather. The fact that this cub was here, alone, injured and dying, suggested that something had already gone terribly wrong. What if he did nothing, and the cub died right outside his door? Samuel had spent his entire adult life fighting death, refusing to let it win without a battle. The Hippocratic Oath didn't specify human life, it simply said, do no harm and preserve life. Could he really stand here watching through a window while a young creature died when he had the knowledge and ability to save it? The cub couldn't be more than 6 months old, probably born the previous spring, still dependent on its mother for survival. It was somebody's baby, and it was dying alone in the cold. Samuel remembered his first day in medical school, when his anatomy professor had said something that stuck with him through every difficult case. The moment you stop seeing the patient as a living being worthy of your best effort is the moment you should find another profession. This wasn't a patient in the traditional sense, but it was certainly a living being, and it was certainly worthy of effort. The cub hadn't chosen to be here, hadn't done anything to deserve this slow, cold death. It was simply a victim of circumstances beyond its control, just like the car accident victims and overdose cases he'd treated for decades. His hands trembled as he pressed them against the cold window, not from the cold but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with life-or-death moments. He remembered the 3-year-old boy who'd fallen through ice in a Minneapolis lake, clinically dead for 14 minutes before Samuel and his team brought him back. He remembered the woman pulled from a burning car, her body so damaged that other doctors had written her off before Samuel refused to give up and worked for 6 hours straight to save her life. He remembered the teenage girl who'd overdosed on fentanyl, her parents screaming in the hallway while Samuel shocked her heart back to life 4 separate times. In every one of those cases, there had been risk. Risk of infection, risk of legal liability, risk of making things worse instead of better. But Samuel had learned long ago that the biggest risk of all was doing nothing when you had the power to act. The regrets that haunted his dreams weren't about the patients he'd tried to save and lost. They were about the times he'd hesitated, the moments when protocol or fear had made him second-guess his instincts. The cub's eyes fluttered open and seemed to look directly at him through the storm, and Samuel felt something break inside his chest. Those weren't the eyes of a predator or a wild animal. They were the eyes of a frightened child, lost and alone and running out of time. The same look he'd seen in countless emergency rooms, the same desperate hope that someone, anyone, would care enough to help. What would you do if a life was in your hands, but helping could put your own at risk? Samuel had faced this question 1,000 times in his medical career, but never quite like this, never with his own life hanging in the balance alongside the patient's. Section 5. Critical Decision, the Act of Courage, 900 words. The moment of decision arrived like lightning splitting the night sky. Samuel watched the cub's body convulse once, then go terrifyingly still, and something primal and unstoppable ignited in his chest. 30 years of medical training overrode every survival instinct, every rational thought, every ounce of common sense that screamed at him to stay inside where it was safe. This was no longer about weighing risks or calculating odds. This was about the fundamental choice that had defined his entire career. Do you fight for life, or do you let death win without a battle? Samuel moved with the swift, purposeful efficiency that had saved countless lives in trauma bays across the country. He grabbed 2 thermal blankets from his emergency supplies, the thick military-grade ones designed for Arctic conditions that he'd bought when he first moved to Alaska. His hands shook as he pulled on his heaviest parka, not from fear but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency situations. He'd felt this same electric current in his veins during mass casualty events, during natural disasters, during every moment when seconds meant the difference between life and death. The wind hit him like a physical blow the moment he opened his door, driving snow into his face with such force that it felt like being sandblasted. The cold was so intense that his lungs seized up with the first breath, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly and deliberately to avoid going into shock. The temperature differential between his heated cabin and the Arctic air outside was so extreme that his body's immediate response was to retreat. But Samuel pushed forward into the storm with the same determination that had carried him through medical school, through residency, through every impossible case he'd ever faced. The cub lay motionless in the snow, its small body nearly buried under the drifts that had accumulated around it during its final struggle. Samuel dropped to his knees beside the young bear, his medical training automatically taking over as he assessed the situation with clinical precision. Hypothermia, severe. Dehydration, likely. Injury to the left hind leg, possibly broken. Breathing, barely detectable. Pulse, weak, but present. The cub was alive, but just barely, existing in that narrow space between life and death that Samuel knew so well. Working with practiced efficiency despite the howling wind and blinding snow, Samuel wrapped the first thermal blanket around the cub's torso, tucking it carefully around the small body to create an insulating cocoon. The bear was smaller than he'd expected, probably weighing no more than 30 pounds, and its fur was soaked through with melted snow that had refrozen into ice crystals. Samuel could feel how dangerously cold the cub's body temperature had dropped. This was advanced hypothermia, the kind that killed even healthy adults in hospital settings if not treated aggressively and immediately. As he prepared to lift the cub, Samuel's awareness expanded beyond the immediate medical crisis to the larger danger he was facing. Every shadow in the storm could be the mother bear. Every sound beyond the wind could be the approach of claws and teeth and maternal fury that would end his life in seconds. His neck prickled with the primitive awareness that he was being watched, that somewhere in the swirling white chaos around him, something large and powerful might be deciding whether he was a threat to be eliminated or a helper to be tolerated. But Samuel had learned long ago that you can't save lives while paralyzed by fear of what might happen. He carefully slid his arms under the cub's body, one supporting the head and chest, the other cradling the hindquarters, taking special care not to move the injured leg. The bear was heavier than expected, its waterlogged fur adding significant weight. But Samuel had carried human patients under far more difficult circumstances. The cub's body was so cold that it felt like lifting a small, fur-covered block of ice. With his precious cargo secured in his arms and the second thermal blanket draped over both of them, Samuel turned back toward his cabin. The 20 feet between where he'd found the cub and his front door felt like 20 miles as he struggled through snow that reached his knees, fighting winds that tried to knock him off balance with every step. His back and shoulders screamed in protest as he maintained his grip on the cub while navigating the treacherous terrain. But he'd carried wounded soldiers in Iraq, had lifted unconscious patients from car wrecks, had hauled bleeding victims up flights of stairs when elevators weren't working. The warmth of his cabin hit him like a physical embrace when he finally pushed through his front door, kicking it closed behind him with his boot. Samuel's adrenaline was still pumping so hard that his hands shook as he carried the cub to the area near his wood stove, the warmest spot in the cabin. He knew from treating hundreds of hypothermia cases that rewarming had to be gradual and controlled. Too much heat too fast could send the cub's body into shock and kill it just as surely as the cold would have. Samuel placed the wrapped cub on a pile of additional blankets near the stove, close enough to benefit from the radiant heat, but not so close as to cause burns or overheating. As he knelt beside his unlikely patient, checking for breathing and pulse with the same clinical precision he'd used on thousands of human patients, one thought echoed through his mind. He'd just brought a wild bear into his home, and somewhere outside in the storm, its mother might be looking for it. Inside the warmth of his cabin, Samuel transformed into the emergency physician he'd been for 3 decades, his movements precise and purposeful as he worked to save a life that was hanging by the thinnest of threads. The cub lay motionless on the pile of blankets, its breathing so shallow that Samuel had to watch carefully to detect the slight rise and fall of its small chest. He'd seen this same critical state in human hypothermia victims, the body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart, existing in a suspended animation between life and death. Samuel's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began the rewarming process, drawing on knowledge gained from treating countless cold water drowning victims and exposure cases during his years in northern hospitals. He wrapped additional warm blankets around the cub's core, knowing that the torso had to be warmed first to prevent the dangerous phenomenon of afterdrop, where cold blood from the extremities rushing back to the heart could trigger cardiac arrest. His fingers found the cub's pulse point on its neck, feeling for the weak but steady rhythm that told him the heart was still fighting. The cub's body temperature was dangerously low. Samuel estimated it had dropped to somewhere around 85 degrees, well into the range where brain damage and organ failure became real threats. Working quickly, he filled his largest pot with warm water, testing the temperature with his elbow the same way he'd check a baby's bath water. Too hot would cause burns to the cub's compromised circulation. Too cool would be ineffective against the life-threatening hypothermia. Samuel soaked several towels in the warm water, wringing them out carefully before placing them against the cub's chest and abdomen. He'd learned this technique during his residency in Minnesota, where winter brought a steady stream of hypothermia cases to the emergency room. The warm, wet towels would provide gentle, controlled heat transfer directly to the body's core, mimicking the effect of the specialized rewarming equipment he'd used on human patients. But the cub wasn't responding as quickly as Samuel had hoped. Its breathing remained dangerously shallow, and its pulse was growing weaker instead of stronger. In the hospital, this would be the moment when he'd call for heated IV fluids, for intubation equipment, for all the advanced interventions that modern medicine could provide. Here, in a remote cabin with nothing but his hands and his knowledge, Samuel had to improvise with techniques that were as old as medicine itself. He made a decision that went against every protocol he'd ever learned but felt right in his gut. Samuel carefully opened his parka and pulled the blanket-wrapped cub against his own chest, using his body heat as a warming device. He'd read about this technique in military survival manuals, had heard stories from Arctic explorers who'd saved each other's lives through shared body heat. The cub's small form fit against his torso like a child, and Samuel wrapped his arms around the bundle, holding it close while monitoring the barely perceptible breathing. Minutes passed like hours as Samuel worked, gently massaging the cub's paws and legs to encourage circulation, whispering encouragement the same way he'd spoken to unconscious patients in the ICU. He'd learned long ago that hearing was often the last sense to go and the first to return, that the sound of a caring human voice could sometimes reach places that medicine couldn't touch. The cub's fur was beginning to warm under his touch, the ice crystals melting and evaporating, but its breathing remained worryingly shallow. Samuel carefully dripped small amounts of warm water onto the cub's tongue, knowing that dehydration was often as dangerous as hypothermia in these cases. He'd treated enough exposure victims to understand that the body's fluid balance was critical to recovery, that even unconscious patients could sometimes be helped with careful oral rehydration. The water seemed to disappear immediately, absorbed by tissues that were desperately depleted. Then, in a moment that stopped Samuel's heart, the cub went completely still. No breathing, no pulse that he could detect. The small body went limp in his arms with the unmistakable weight of death, and Samuel felt the familiar surge of desperate determination that had driven him through every code blue, every crash situation, every moment when death tried to claim a patient on his watch. Working with the controlled panic of emergency medicine, Samuel began gentle chest compressions, his fingers working to restart the tiny heart that had given up its fight. He counted compressions the way he'd done thousands of times before, modified for the smaller body and different anatomy, but driven by the same refusal to accept defeat. His own heart was racing as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold that still clung to his clothes. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Samuel had seen human patients come back after longer periods of cardiac arrest, had witnessed miracles that defied medical explanation. He wasn't giving up now. He continued the compressions, adjusted his technique, tried a different angle, all while speaking to the unconscious cub as if it could hear him. And then, like a miracle unfolding in slow motion, Samuel felt it, the faintest flutter of breath against his hand. The cub's chest rose slightly, fell, rose again. The tiny heart began beating with more strength, and color started returning to the gums and tongue. Samuel had brought the cub back from the edge of death using nothing but knowledge, determination, and the same refusal to give up that had defined his entire medical career. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, something extraordinary happened that would change Samuel forever. The cub's eyes slowly opened, blinking against the soft glow of the cabin's interior, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, those dark, intelligent eyes locked onto Samuel's face with an intensity that took his breath away. This wasn't the vacant stare of a wild animal or the fearful gaze of a creature in panic. This was something deeper, something that reached across the vast divide between species and touched something fundamental in Samuel's soul. The look in those eyes was a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else that Samuel had never seen in his years of treating patients. A kind of wondering recognition, as if the cub was trying to understand what this strange, gentle creature had done for it. Samuel had looked into thousands of human eyes during medical emergencies, had seen gratitude, relief, pain, and hope reflected in the faces of patients he'd saved. But this was different. This was pure, unfiltered emotion without the complexity of human thought, without the barriers that civilization builds between hearts. Samuel found himself unable to look away, mesmerized by the depth of intelligence he saw there. The cub's breathing had steadied into a natural rhythm, its small chest rising and falling with the easy cadence of healthy sleep, but its eyes remained fixed on Samuel's face as if memorizing every detail. There was no fear now, no wild panic or instinct to flee, just this profound connection that seemed to flow between them like an electric current, binding them together in a moment of perfect understanding. The texture of the cub's fur under Samuel's hands was nothing like he'd expected. It was incredibly soft, almost silky, with an underlying warmth that spoke of life returning to what had been a nearly frozen body just hours before. Each strand seemed to capture and hold the firelight, creating a pattern of shadows and highlights that moved with every breath. Samuel could feel the steady rhythm of the cub's heartbeat through his fingertips, strong and sure now, a percussion that seemed to synchronize with his own pulse. The sounds filling the cabin were unlike anything Samuel had experienced in his 2 years of solitude. The cub's breathing was soft but audible, a gentle whisper that mixed with the crackling of the wood fire and the gradually diminishing howl of the wind outside. Occasionally, the cub would make small sounds, not quite purrs, not quite sighs, but something in between that spoke of contentment and safety. These sounds seemed to resonate in Samuel's chest, creating a harmony he hadn't realized he'd been missing during his long months of silence. Samuel's hand moved slowly, almost without conscious thought, to gently stroke the space between the cub's ears. The moment his fingers made contact, the cub's eyes drifted half-closed in what could only be described as bliss, and Samuel felt something crack open in his heart that had been frozen shut since he'd left medicine. This simple gesture of comfort, given and received across the boundary of species, carried more emotional weight than years of human interaction had provided. The emotional bond that was forming felt both impossible and inevitable, like a conversation conducted entirely in feelings rather than words. Samuel had saved human lives and felt professional satisfaction, had received thanks and gratitude from patients and families, but this was something entirely different. This was connection in its purest form, uncompromised by expectations or social conventions or the complicated dynamics of human relationships. As Samuel watched the cub's eyes growing heavy with approaching sleep, he realized that something profound had shifted inside him. The isolation that had driven him to Alaska, the emotional numbness that had followed him from his medical career, the sense of disconnection from the world that had made him choose solitude over society, all of it was being transformed by this simple, wordless exchange with a creature that should have been his natural enemy. The cub's trust was absolute and uncomplicated. It didn't question Samuel's motives or worry about his intentions. It simply accepted the care being offered with the kind of openness that humans spend lifetimes trying to recapture. This pure, unguarded vulnerability was both heartbreaking and healing, showing Samuel a reflection of the person he'd been before years of medical trauma and human complexity had built walls around his heart. In this moment, watching firelight dance across the peaceful face of a sleeping bear cub, Samuel understood something that all his medical training and life experience had never taught him. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not when you save a life, but when saving that life saves something essential in yourself. The cub had needed his medical knowledge and his courage, but Samuel had needed this connection, this reminder of what it felt like to care for something without reservation or fear of loss. As the first golden rays of morning sunlight began to penetrate the storm clouds and filter through the snow-laden pine branches outside Samuel's cabin, something massive moved in the forest beyond. Samuel noticed it first as a shadow that seemed too large and too purposeful to be a trick of the changing light, and his blood turned to ice water in his veins as the reality of what he was seeing began to register. Through the clearing snow, emerging from between the trees like something out of a primordial nightmare, was the mother bear. She was enormous, easily 6 feet tall at the shoulder even on all fours, her dark brown fur rippling with muscle that spoke of power beyond human comprehension. Samuel had seen bears before during his time in Alaska, had spotted them from safe distances through binoculars, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer presence of this magnificent creature. Every step she took seemed to make the ground tremble, and her massive head swayed from side to side as she scanned the area, with the focused intensity of a mother searching for her lost child. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched her approach, every survival instinct screaming at him to grab the cub and barricade himself inside the cabin. This was the moment he'd been dreading since the rescue began, the confrontation that could end with him being torn apart by claws that could slice through steel. But something unexpected was happening. The mother bear wasn't charging. She wasn't roaring or showing the aggressive posturing that Samuel had read about in wildlife guides. Instead, she was moving with careful deliberation, her massive head held high as she tested the air with her extraordinary sense of smell. She stopped perhaps 30 feet from the cabin, close enough that Samuel could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, could observe the way her nostrils flared as she processed the complex scent information that told her everything she needed to know about what had happened to her cub. Samuel held his breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might trigger an attack. But the great bear simply stood there, watching, waiting, making some calculation that only she could understand. Inside the cabin, The cub had awakened at some primal signal that Samuel couldn't detect. It lifted its head with renewed strength, its eyes bright and alert, and made soft vocalizations that carried clearly through the morning air. These weren't cries of distress, but something else entirely. Communications between mother and child that transcended human understanding. The mother bear's massive head tilted slightly as she listened, and Samuel could swear he saw something like relief cross her features. Samuel knew what he had to do, even though every rational part of his mind rebelled against the idea. Moving with slow, deliberate motions that he hoped would communicate peaceful intentions, he gathered the cub gently in the thermal blanket and approached his door. The mother bear's eyes tracked his movement with laser focus, but she remained stationary, neither advancing nor retreating. Samuel opened the door with one hand while cradling the cub with the other, stepping into the cold morning air that still carried the bite of the previous night's storm. The distance between his door and where the mother waited felt like walking across a minefield. Each step could be his last if the great bear decided he represented a threat rather than a savior. Samuel moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his eyes averted from direct contact while remaining aware of every detail of the mother's posture and positioning. When he was still 10 feet away, he gently placed the cub on the snow-covered ground and stepped back, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. The reunion was both immediate and intensely moving. The mother bear approached her cub with surprising gentleness for such a massive creature, sniffing and nuzzling the small body while making low sounds that spoke of relief and maternal love. The cub responded with enthusiasm that proved its recovery was complete, nuzzling against its mother's massive form with the unrestrained joy of a child who thought it would never see home again. But before they disappeared into the forest, something remarkable happened that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. The mother bear turned back toward him, and for a long moment that seemed to stretch across species and understanding, she looked directly into his eyes. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was acknowledgement, recognition, perhaps even gratitude. If this story moved your heart even a little, if Samuel's courage in that frozen wilderness reminded you that compassion knows no boundaries, then you understand why stories like this matter so much in our world today. This isn't just about one man and one bear cub on a cold Alaskan night. This is about the incredible connections that happen when we choose love over fear, when we decide that saving a life is worth any risk, when we remember that every living creature deserves a chance to survive and thrive. Imagine the other stories waiting for you here on this channel. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of moments when humanity shines brightest in the darkest places, of connections that transcend every barrier we think separates us from each other and from the natural world around us. These are the stories that remind us who we really are beneath all the noise and chaos of modern life. These are the moments that prove compassion isn't weakness, it's the strongest force in the universe. Join our community of people who believe that kindness matters, that courage can change everything, that sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest miracles. Click that subscribe button and become part of something beautiful, something that celebrates the very best of what it means to be human. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these incredible journeys we take together, these glimpses into the hearts of people who refuse to let darkness win. Our next story will leave you speechless, a tale of survival against impossible odds that will remind you why hope is never foolish and why love always finds a way. Don't miss it, because stories like these don't just entertain us. They transform us, they heal us. They remind us that in a world that can feel cold and disconnected, there are still people like Samuel who will risk everything to answer a cry for help. That could be you. That could be all of us.